Well, good evening, and welcome to the United States Geological Survey. I'm Diane Garcia, and I work for our Science Information Services, and I'm thrilled to see you all here for our October public lecture. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to go ahead and remind you that USGS has been hosting these public lectures since 1990, and many of them have been videotaped and are online for your viewing. The best way to find them is to just simply put USGS public lecture into your search engine, and voila, you'll be at the website. I'd also like to go ahead and make you look back in the back corner at that table. We have some nifty things back there. There's a poster on balancing fire hazard and resource protection. There's a display of John's book, Fire in Mediterranean Ecosystems. There's a leaflet with viewing information for the video Living with Fire, the USGS Southern California Wildfire Risk Project, as well as a flyer for next month's public lecture, which is on San Francisco Bay waterbirds. Here it is. I encourage you to pick one up on your way out if you haven't already. We hope that you're here on November 19th for that presentation. We did move it up a week because our normal fourth Thursday time slot happens to be Thanksgiving. But back to what we're here for tonight, and it's the lecture, Fire-Climate Relationships in the Sierra Nevada, Surprises Relevant to Future Fire Regime Forecasts, and it will be presented by Dr. John Keeley. John received his PhD from the University of Georgia in botany and ecology. He is a senior research scientist with USGS, adjunct professor at UCLA, former program director at the National Science Foundation, recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and Ecological Society of America Fellow. He has spent sabbatical leaves in all of the Mediterranean climate regions of the world. John has over 350 publications in national and international scientific journals and books. And he's garnered more than 15,000 citations. He is senior author of the 2012 Cambridge University Press book, Fire in Mediterranean Climate Ecosystems, Ecology, Evolution, and Management. He currently is at Sequoia and Kings Canyon Field Station. The United States Geological Survey's monthly public lecture series is pleased to bring you a program today about wildfires. And I'm going to ask that you please hold any of your questions till the end of the talk. So now, please, let's go ahead and give a warm welcome to John Keeley.
Thank you, Diane. The main focus of what I'm going to talk about tonight has to do with issues of climate change and how that might affect future fires. But before I get into talking about these issues of fire-climate relationships, I'm going to start off a little slow and give you kind of a broad overview of fire issues in California so that you get a better idea of what the diversity of issues are in the state in terms of fire. Mike, Diane, can we shut off this front row of lights? I think Mike said he would do that. I appreciate that. One of the things to note about California is that it's just part of the western U.S. that experiences extensive wildfires every year. And this just gives you a relative idea of how much acreage burns in the western U.S. in orange there, and how in red is how much burns in California. But one of the important things about California is probably a much greater proportion of California burns than other parts of the West. Plus, California is much more densely populated than much of the western U.S. So if one looks at the amount of money that goes into fighting fires, California dominates the fire suppression costs in the western U.S., even though more acres are probably burned or are burned outside of California. From a management perspective, this is really important because anymore agencies are being forced to take money to fight fires out of other resource management pots of money. And as a consequence, as we put more and more money into fire suppression efforts, agencies are finding they have less and less money to do management of resources in their state and federal lands. So that's an important issue related to how much money we spend on fires. Now, a lot of my work in the past has been done in Southern California, and I like to think of this as sort of a typical autumn day in Southern California. We get these Santa Ana winds, and if somebody ignites a fire during these Santa Ana winds, we can get massive fires. And since many of our metropolitan areas are juxtaposed next to watersheds of really dangerous fuels, they're extremely susceptible to fires burning into the urban interface. And I don't know if any of you are fans of the Onion newspaper, but one year they talked about how Californians annually celebrate the annual wildfire tradition by coming out and celebrating these events and then feigning shock that this could have happened to them when their house burns down. But it's a very real issue. When we think about housing losses from wildfires, California dominates the world scene in terms of housing losses. Since about 1950, we've averaged about 500 homes a year lost from wildfires. In the last 10 years, that's doubled. So now we average about 1,000 homes a year lost to wildfires. There's no other place in the world that has the threat to developments from wildfires as California. Now, those of you who paid attention to the newspapers this year recognize that this is a distribution of some of the fires we had this year. We had a big one up in Lake County, and we had some up in the northwest, and even a huge one down where I am in Sequoia down here, the Rough Fire, which ended up being well over 150,000 acres in size. So we had some really big fires this year. But what's interesting about it is most all of them were concentrated in the central and northern part of the state. Southern California has had very few fires this year. And part of the reason for that is the climate is very different this year in Southern California than is normally the case. And the statistic that really impresses me is San Diego County this July had more rain than in the last 101 Julys combined. So it was an extremely unusual year in the southern part of the state. As a result, the northern part of the state had lots of fires, southern part of the state had very little. And it turns out this is a common pattern. This, some of you may remember, this is from 2008, and these were some major fires. We had a whole series of fires in the northern half of the state in 2008. Southern half of the state, we had almost nothing going on. And this is a common pattern. For example, this was 2003, and this is the southern part of the state. This is San Diego here, and these are these major fires driven by these Santa Ana winds. And those of you who aren't familiar with Santa Ana winds, they occur typically in the autumn, and they result from a high-pressure cell out in the Great Basin, low-pressure cell off the coast, and it drives really high-speed winds, like 60, 70 mile per hour winds with 5% relative humidity. So it creates really disastrous fire conditions. This was from 2003. In 2007, we had a very similar series of fires in more or less the same places. But in those two years, 2003, 2007, we had very little fire in the north. So it's important to realize that we have two very different parts of the state in terms of when fires are major issues, and there are different climatic reasons that go along with that. But there's also a lot of other reasons. For example, demographic reasons that separate north from the south. Southern California has about an order of magnitude higher density of people, and as a result of more people in the south, we have more fires accounted for by people. For example, if we look in the northern California interior, say up in the northeastern part of the county, over half of all our fires are started by lightning. If you look at coastal Southern California, less than 1% are started by lightning. People are the primary driver of fires, and the amount of area burned in the south is annually, on average, much higher than in the northern part of the state. So we really have two very different fire patterns within the state. And this is illustrated in an interesting study that was done last year by the Forest Service. And what the Forest Service did is they looked at all of their national forests, and that's what's in the colors there. And they asked the question, in the last 100 years, how has the fire activity compared to what we think historically was the natural fire regime? And what they found is everything here in blue are areas that have had, in the last 100 years, fewer fires than we believe historically was the case. All the hot colors here, yellow and orange, are areas that have had more fires in the last 100 years than we think historically was the case. So we really have two different Californias. There's Southern California and Northern California, including the Sierra Nevada. So in terms of fires, they're very different regimes in the north and the south. Now, part of the reason that we get these different patterns is we have very different vegetation in these parts of the state. In the north, we get more rainfall, and as well as in the Sierra Nevada. And with more rainfall, we get more productivity of the forests, and we get trees that are very tall trees, and those trees, in a sense, are able to escape fires, because the fires that start in the Sierras, typically in many parts of the Northwest in forests, tend to burn fuels that are on the understory of the forest floor. And the fact that these trees can grow very tall and they lose all their dead branches down below produces a gap between the fire at the surface of the forest and a fire fire getting into the canopy of the trees. And so they have historically burned like in this low intensity surface fire regime. Now, if you get lower in elevation or lower in latitude in the state, the less rainfall produces basically less productivity, and you get shrublands like this. And shrublands basically can't outgrow fire. And so when fires occur in shrublands, they burn the entire vegetation in what fire scientists would call a crown fire, which is described as high-intensity fire that burns the entire vegetation, usually to the ground. So a lot of the patterns of fires are the result of different precipitation patterns and different productivity patterns of the plants. Now, we know that this pattern in forests has been historically the case because we have an excellent record of past fires in our forests. And I would estimate there's probably thousands of studies like this around the western U.S. where scientists have gone in and they found trees in these forests which have a scar on them from a past fire that burned in the understory. And if you cut through that tree and take a slab like this is the outer bark of the tree, and here's this scar here, you can see actually evidence of past scars, and you can relate them to the growth rings, and you can actually estimate past fire history in these forests. And so, for example, we have very good records like this in Sequoia National Park from giant sequoia trees, and we know for at least the last 2,000 years, those forests have historically burned at maybe 10 to 20 year intervals until about the early 1900s. And then the fire frequency was cut off completely, and that was largely a management decision because the federal government came in and took over management of forests in the Sierras and other western forests and decided we had to put fires out. So they suppressed all the fires, and now we don't get fires in these forests. And that's potentially a management problem in these forests because it changes the fuel structure. When you stop fires from burning, and we have places in the Sierras where they've gone 100 years without a fire when historically they would have burned every 20 years. As a result, they get a lot more fuel accumulating. So when you do get a fire, the fire becomes a crown fire like in Chaparral and destroys the whole forest. And you can see an illustration here of a big fire, and this was from Mount Lemmon in Arizona in a ponderosa forest, very much like our forests in the Sierras. The entire scene here burned. The foreground here burned in what we would think of as close to a natural fire because it burned largely in the understory. Occasionally it would kill a few trees here and there, produce little patches, but by and large most of the stand survived. And that's critical for the survival of these forests because in order to reproduce, they need to have fire produce a gap in the canopy to let light in for seedlings to grow. But they need a seed source, and so they need trees around them to drop seeds into those gaps. But here's a part of that fire that had unusual fuel accumulation, probably had high winds associated with it as well. And here the entire forest was burned down for a very large distance. And in terms of regeneration of that forest, it represents a significant problem because now the seeds have to come from these trees here all the way into these very remote burned areas. And as a result, it's likely to take a very long time for this part of the forest to regenerate, just because this is an anomalous condition that they historically would not have experienced very often. Now, in Southern California, we don't have in chaparral landscapes, and the same in lower elevations here in the North Coast and in the Sierras in the foothills. We don't have trees that burned in low severity fires, so we don't have any good record of what was happening over the last 1,000 years or so. But we do have records showing fires just in the last 100 years, and that's what's illustrated here. This is for 9 of the counties going from Monterey to San Diego, and this is just the amount of area that burned every decade in the 20th century. And basically you can see, for example, LA County is a good example here. There hasn't been a lot of variation. In other words, we haven't stopped fires in those systems. We've had, in fact, if we estimate how much of the county this is, it's about a third of the county burns every decade. So we know in these types of landscapes, we have not necessarily altered the fire regime other than perhaps increasing the amount of burning over the last 100 years. Now, when we get a fire in the shrublands, it looks kind of like this. And this is not an anomaly. This is what these landscapes typically look like and have looked like for a very long time. And we have good fossil records in the state showing that the species in chaparral that seem to survive just fine have been around for a very long time, at least 15 million years. And some of them have persisted even further back in time than that. So we believe fire is not a modern phenomenon in these systems. It's been around for a very long time. And an illustration of this is when one looks at how these plants recover after fire. This is what these chaparral landscapes look like in the first spring after a fire. They green up very, very quickly. And they do this all endogenously. In other words, they do it from either seeds in the soil or regenerating from the base of the plant. And they have a number of interesting mechanisms that illustrate this long history with fire in these systems. The most ubiquitous of all our shrubs is this plant here called chamise. It's found throughout the state. In fact, the green here, it describes the distribution of chamise, which is almost synonymous with chaparral. It's hard to find areas where you have chaparral and you don't have this shrub here. And it not only is able to regenerate after fire from the base by resprouting, but it also produces seeds that sit dormant in the soil, and they'll sit there for 100 years if there's no fire. And then right after the fire, they'll germinate and produce a whole new stand of shrubs. So in a sense, these plants are not just fire adapted. They're not just able to survive fire. They actually are fire dependent. They can't regenerate if they don't get fire in the system. We have a number of shrubs in the state that are like that. These are a very colorful shrub called California lilac, and they go by a variety of names because there's probably 60 or 70 species in the state. And they also have seeds that go into the soil. They'll sit there for as long as it takes until a fire comes, and then the fire will trigger their germination, and they will then regenerate. If you don't get a fire, these things don't regenerate. Another shrub, some of you may know this, if you ever go out into the shrubland landscape, these manzanita shrubs, which have the bright red bark. In the winter, which is quite unusual for most plants in the state, they'll start flowering, produce these very pretty flowers, but most people know them because they produce these little round fruits here, which is where they get the name manzanita, because manzanita is Spanish for little apple. Has anybody ever tried to eat one of these little apples, though? If you have, you'll find out they're not really like a little apple at all. In fact, I heard an interpreter once say that the Indians in California could go for 3 days eating nothing but manzanita berries, but he added they could go 4 days eating nothing at all. Now, one of the interesting things with the manzanitas, and this is true of a few of the other shrubs, is if you look at the base of the stem, they produce this woody tuber. And that tuber, which is called a basal burl, basically is how the plant regenerates after a fire. When a fire comes through and burns the top of the shrub off, they'll send up new shoots from the base. And chamise does the same thing. It has a lignotuber sending up shoots here from the base after a fire, in addition to producing seedlings like the ceanothus and the chamise do. So these plants basically have built-in mechanisms for dealing with fire. So when we see a massive crown fire in these chaparral shrublands, we shouldn't think of this as a disaster. It's actually a rejuvenation for that system, because without it, many of these species couldn't regenerate. It's also reflected in wildflower displays in the first spring after a fire. If you go into a burned area, and I'm sure Lake County will have areas this spring that will look like this, in the first spring there will be this massive display of wildflowers. And we have something on the order of about 200 species in the state that are largely restricted to burned areas, and they come from dormant seeds in the soil that are triggered to germinate by fire. And when I was a student, I was always told that that was because the heat of the fire basically melted the seed coat and allowed them to germinate. But over the last several decades, myself and students have been studying germination of these species, particularly the wildflowers. And what we find is it isn't heat at all that triggers the germination of most of them. It appears to be chemicals that have come from the smoke and charred wood, and this is just a series of experiments that illustrates that. This is just the amount of germination for 6 different species, and this is the amount of germination for controls. This is the amount if you heat them, and then this is the amount if you expose them to smoke or some chemical from charred wood. And so these species have a very closely evolved relationship with fire. And in many of the cases, we believe these things go back tens of millions of years. And so here's another group of plants in this system that are actually not just able to tolerate fire, they actually depend upon fire. Now, the 2 different descriptions I've decided of different fire regimes, once again, let me just say the forested systems tend to be these ones in the northern part of the state, the Sierra Nevada. They tend to have low severity surface fires historically in the past, but they're areas where they have been managed under a policy of fire suppression, and fires have been put out. In fact, fires are very easily put out in these systems, and as a result, for the last 100 years, these systems are areas that we believe have had fewer fires than historically was the case. And there's a lot of interest in trying to put fire back into that system to restore the natural fire cycle, to keep fuels down so you don't get massive crown fires. In the southern half of the state, though, we have a system where we historically have had very high intensity crown fires. When fires get started in that system, they're still managed by the same policy of fire suppression. It's just that fire managers can't put the fires out, and as a result, over the last 100 years, these areas have had more fire than historically we believe was the case. And that's largely due to the fact that there are humans lighting many more fires than lightning would have ignited in the past. Plus, they're very hard to put out. Now, the interest that our research group has is focused around the question of, okay, we have good reason to believe that climates are changing, and that is potentially forced in large part by human activities, the generation of carbon dioxide in the air, and this just illustrates over the last 120 years or so the change in CO2 levels. in the atmosphere and the change in temperature, which is on average but going up. And temperatures, higher temperatures, tend to be associated with really dangerous burning conditions. So there's a lot of concern that as temperatures continue to increase, they are going to potentially drive worse fires throughout the state. Now, to just give you a synopsis of where we're going with all this, the bottom line is that we find out in the research we've been doing that it's not that simple, like a lot of things in science, and the role of climate is very different in these forested systems than it is in the lower elevation shrubland systems. Now, there's good evidence in a number of studies in the West that in particular, as temperatures have been going up, spring temperatures seem to be associated with an increase in forest fires throughout the West, and you can find lots of media sources that will declare that the American West is just burning up due to global warming, and we're all going to be doomed in the future. But what you'll also see is very different opinions. This is actually taken from the LA Times last week, where some scientists are suggesting that maybe this link between climate change and wildfires is a little bit overstated, because there are a lot of other reasons why fires activity may change over time. And so there's still a lot of controversy about the role of global warming, its impact on fires, and what the future holds for fire regimes. Now, part of the reason that they dispute the idea that things have already gotten worse, and this is suggested in a number of media publications where they've seen big fire events, and they go, okay, we have these big fire events, and that's totally unnatural, and therefore things are already getting bad because of climate change. Turns out that's really an overstatement of the history of fires in California. And this is just a figure that shows the size of the largest fires in California in different regions of the state over the last about 150 years. And as one of the things you can notice here is even going back to the early 1900s, we had big fire events just like we see today. And we see this same pattern in at least most of the regions in the state. Big fire events in the past, as well as some big fire events today. And so the fact that we've always had big fire events complicates this picture that if you see a big fire, that means things are getting worse. Not necessarily the case. Now, what we're interested in doing is asking the question, okay, is there any way we can make predictions about what the future holds in terms of global warming and its impact on fires? And one way to look at this question is to look at historical records. And we have good records going back to about 100 years on some parts of our landscape, like U.S. Forest Service lands. We have 100-year records. The state lands, which are the lower elevation lands, we have almost that length of record. And these records tell us every year how much area burned. And then we also have very good climatic data going back that long. And we can ask the question, okay, on a year-to-year basis, when the amount of area burns varies from one year to the next, is there any relationship with climate? And so that's the primary question that we have addressed. Is there a relationship between the amount of area burns from year to year varied in relationship to climate, and does it vary between the forests versus the lower elevation shrublands and grasslands? And the way we've addressed that is use two different agencies' data. This is U.S. Forest Service lands in the state. These are typically higher elevation coniferous forest landscapes. And they have records going from 1910 up to the present. And then we've taken another source of data from the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, which goes by the name CAL FIRE today. And they represent basically the lower elevation landscapes, what the state calls state responsibility area. And state responsibility area for fire is all of that landscape not managed for fire by the federal government, but low enough housing density that it is not considered part of the urban environment, because once housing density increases, then it's the local community's responsibility. So it's everything between communities and the higher elevation forest. And their data goes back as far as 1919. Now, at the present time, we're looking at this across the entire state, but I'm not going to try and talk about the entire state. I'm just going to pick one region, and that's largely the Sierra Nevada. And what we have done is try and pick an area that is more or less homogeneous in terms of climate. And the way we've done that is we've used the NOAA climate divisions. NOAA has divided California into 7 different climate regions, and we're just today going to talk about this region here, which is largely represents the Sierra Nevada and the foothills along the Central Valley landscape, and that's illustrated here. The green are the Forest Service lands, and the brown is the Cal Fire lands. And so we're looking at the fire history data on those 2 landscapes, primarily in the Sierra Nevada. Just to emphasize once again, this is what these landscapes look like. Forest Service lands are largely forests. Cal Fire lands are largely grasslands and shrublands and some open woodlands. A few characteristics of these 2 different landscapes. As I already mentioned, Forest Service lands, much higher elevation than the Cal Fire lands. And the vegetation, very different. It's almost entirely coniferous forest. Cal Fire is really a mosaic of a lot of lands or vegetation types, including shrublands, grasslands, and woodlands. But if you look at what actually burns on these landscapes, most of what burns in the lower elevation tends to be grasslands. At least historically, they've dominated the burning, as well as shrublands. The 2 seem to dominate what burns in the lower elevations. A few other characteristics, not surprising, the lower elevations, more people, more houses, and as a result of more people, we get more fires in these lower elevations, and more of the area over the last 100 years is burned on those elevations. Now, this is one of the interesting characteristics that we've seen in these 2 different data sets, is that if you look at every decade, the amount of landscape that is burned, both the forests and the lower foothills, the majority of area that burned in the last 100 years was in the 1920s. So the 1920s was a major year for fires in the state, both in the mountains as well as the foothills. And then it declined up until the 1960s on Forest Service lands. And then since 1960, it started to increase. And this increase is seen in a lot of forests in the western U.S., and it's one of the pieces of evidence that people have used to suggest that global warming is changing our fire regimes and causing more land to burn, and they'll point to this increase in Forest Service lands as evidence that that's in fact going on. What's interesting is you look at the lower elevations, that high activity of burning in the 20s declined, and then it's been basically flat for the last 50 years in the lower elevation. So we don't see this rise that you see in the forests. We see it basically flattened off here. So it illustrates, first off, that there's something different going on with fires on these 2 different landscapes. Now let's begin by focusing on the forests and just ask the question, okay, over the last 100 years, how has the amount of area burned every year varied in association with temperature? And so what we've done here is we plotted the area burned, and this is normalized to the amount of area that we're looking at. And we've asked the question, okay, what about winter temperatures? How have winter temperatures affected fires? Turns out winter temperatures have no effect on fires at all in these forests. Basically just a straight line with points up and on either side of that line. But we do see a change in the relationship in the spring and the summer, indicating that warmer springs and warmer summers have been associated in the past with higher fire activity in the forests. Autumn is a lot like the winter, very little relationship between temperature and amount of area burned. Now, we also see a strong relationship with precipitation. And in these forested systems, probably the strongest relationship is spring precipitation. As precipitation goes up, we see less and less area burned on these landscapes. When we have very dry springs, we're associated with much greater fire activity. We do see somewhat of a weak relationship with winter precipitation and summer precipitation. So both precipitation and temperature seem to be correlated with high fire activity on these forested landscapes. Now when we move down out of the mountains in the Sierras and we look at the foothills and look at this relationship, what we find is nothing closely related to what we see in the mountains. We see basically very little relationship between temperature and area burned. There's a slightly significant increase here in spring temperatures, but the other seasons, there's no significant relationship between temperature in any of those other seasons and the amount of area burned. And the same with precipitation. No relationship between how much rain you get in a year in winter, spring, summer, or autumn, and the amount of area that burns that year. So we see a big difference right away in terms of how fire and climate relationships are working on our landscape. They're very different depending on where you are on our landscape. And one of the things it illustrates is it's very difficult to make generalizations at this point in time, although you wouldn't know that by reading some of the journalism that's written on the topic. I'll just point out another interesting thing about the fire-climate relationships that we see in these forests. This is just a model that looks at what determines the amount of area burned and which climatic patterns or parameters have the biggest impact. And then we've broken the Forest Service data into the first half of the record and the second half of the record. And it's interesting, the relationship seems to have changed over time. In the first 50 years, the big climatic parameters that were determining area burned in the Sierras were precipitation in the spring and winter. But in the last 50 years, the big factor tends to be summer temperatures along with spring precipitation. So we have seen a relationship between climate and fire both early and later in the record, but the variables that are affecting it are different depending on whether you're looking early in the record or late in the record. So let me just summarize some of the things that we can say about fire-climate relationships between these higher forested environments and the lower elevation non-forested environments. First off, it's pretty clear that spring and summer temperatures and precipitation are the big determinants of whether or not you're going to have a big fire year, or at least they contribute significantly to that variation. And we believe the primary role that climate is playing, in other words, the primary role of high temperatures in the spring or low precipitation in the spring, the primary thing it's affecting is the moisture in the fuels in those forests. So if we have a hot spring, very little rain, the vegetation in the forest has much less moisture in it, and that's what drives the higher fire activity in that year. The other thing that's important from what we found in terms of predicting global warming impacts is this impact of temperature is very dependent on season. And so when we look at global change patterns and we see predictions that show that temperatures are on the rise and are likely, based on model results, to continue rising, those numbers are typically expressed as the average annual temperature. And what we can tell from the work we've done is that doesn't really tell you very much about what the impact is on fire, because if this is happening in the winter, then it should have no effect at all, because we don't see a strong relationship between winter temperature and fires. If it's happening in the spring, then this rise may be something to be concerned about. And so it's something that so far in discussions of future climates has not been addressed very much, and that is how seasonal patterns of temperatures have changed over time and what we predict the temperature changes to be in particular seasons. So in terms of understanding fire, it's really important to know what season the temperature change is occurring, and a graph like this that just shows annual average temperature probably isn't going to tell you very much in and of itself. Now, another thing that's of concern is the state has actually had a fairly extensive drought for the last 50 years, at least on average. We've had high rainfall years in many years in the last 50 years, but when you take the decadal average, the state has been, at least a large part of the state, has been under drought conditions, and that's illustrated here by what's called the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And the way you interpret this is anything that's above 0 here is considered a wet decade. Anything below 0 is considered a drought. And what we can see is for about the last 50 years, we've had some pretty severe droughts. Now, some people have suggested that that's due to anthropogenic climate change impacts. The bottom line is the models are not at all good at this point in terms of predicting to what extent precipitation is being affected by anthropogenic impacts on climate. So at this point, we can't really say if this is due to anthropogenic impacts. And in fact, it could just be part of our natural drought cycle, because we have very good records from tree rings, and you can actually determine the amount of rainfall from tree rings by looking at the width of the ring. And so there's records for the West going back all the way to the 1300s, and this is the Palmer Drought Index. These are drought cycles here, these are wet cycles here. And the bottom line is over the last certainly 700 or 800 years, we've had some fairly severe and extensive droughts. For example, here's one in the 1400s where we went for maybe 50 years in a drought. So we have had these cycles in the past. The current drought could be part of that cycle, or it could be tied to anthropogenic effects. At the present, we don't really know. Another thing, though, is it's really hard to sort out when you have a drought whether an increase in temperature is due to global warming or whether it's due to the lack of rain, because what happens when it rains? You get lots of cloud cover. When you get lots of cloud cover, it doesn't get as hot. And in fact, this is climate data for the state where we plotted spring precipitation here and the mean temperature in the spring. And what you see is when it rains, it basically, the temperature goes down. When you have a drought, like down here, temperatures go up. And so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of understanding this increase in temperature. How much of that is due to global warming impacts from rise in CO2, and how much of it is due to this drought that we've been, which has basically reduced cloud cover, and that in and of itself causes temperatures to go up. So the bottom line is it's a lot more complex than a lot of people want to make it out to be at the present time. Now, the last thing I'll just focus on is this relationship of fire and climate in the foothills outside the forest. The bottom line is we don't see any relationship or any strong relationship between climate in a given year and how much area burns when you're in the foothills. We do have one characteristic, though, that is strongly tied to the amount of area that burns in the foothills, and that's the amount of rain in the year before. And the reason we believe rain the year before might affect fires in the foothills is because it increases the amount of grass growth, and then the following year you have lots of fuels which can carry fires. And that's illustrated here. A lot of our foothill landscapes in the Sierras look like this, dominated by grasses, and those grasses are the fuels that carry the fire. Have a high rainfall year, the following year you're likely to have more fires. This year, for example, if any of you have been up into the foothills in the Sierras and have looked at these landscapes, they don't look like this at all. There's nothing there. There basically was very little grass growth, and as a result, this year we've had almost no fires in the foothills in the Sierras. There's just nothing to burn. So what's important in the foothills is how much rain there was the year before, and that affects fuels. And what that tells us in terms of how climate affects fire in forests versus non-forested landscapes. In the forest, climate is affecting the fuel moisture in the given year, and that affects how much is likely to burn in that year. In the foothills, it's affecting the fuel load. It's not affecting the moisture of the fuels. It's affecting the amount of fuel. And so it's a very different relationship between climate and fire in the foothills. Now, one of the things that is suggested by these results, and we've been doing a number of other studies that suggest something very similar, and that is the impact of future global warming is likely to have much less impact in the foothills, and in fact other global changes might outweigh the effect of climate. And by other factors, in particular, our demographic changes. We're expected in California to increase our population size by about 50% in the next 30 years. And since humans are starting many of our fires, and particularly in the lower elevations, we expect that that global change may have a much bigger impact than climate in the future in these lower elevation landscapes. Here's another thing that is going on, and we don't actually know what is driving this, but it's possibly an explanation for some of the patterns we see. And that is the numbers of fires have changed over time, and they haven't changed in a logical way. At least we don't have a good explanation at the present. Basically, on Forest Service lands since 1910, they were increasing until about the 1980s. And then, since the late 80s, they've been going down. Same on CAL FIRE lands. They were going up until about the 80s or so, and then they've been going down. And we don't have a good explanation at the present time. We've had a lot of ideas thrown around. For example, it could be that just changes in patterns of people lighting fires have changed. For example, in the 1970s, people put catalytic converters on their cars, and they caused a lot of fires. In fact, you see an increase in a lot of equipment fires in the 70s and 80s, and it may be that new regulations perhaps have reduced that. Bottom line is we don't know, but it's just another level of complexity about this problem that we really at the present time don't understand. Another thing is there's a lot that controls a fire and how much of a landscape burns. This is an attempt that we've made to try and model all of the things that drive fires in the state. And one of the things our response variable we're interested in is what produces what we call a going fire. That means a fire out of control, which is likely to burn a lot of landscape. And there's a lot of things that control that. One is the initial attack effort of management agencies coming in to attack that fire. Depending on how many resources are put into the suppression effort, that can affect how likely we'll get a big out-of-control fire. But a lot of other things, ignition sources, both from people as well as lightning, which is going to be affected by the weather, fuels, the type of fuels you have on the landscape, and climate is going to affect fuels and the condition of fuels, but also management is going to affect fuels because managers go out and they actually will mechanically cut down certain fuels to try and reduce the load of fuel on the landscape to also affect this. So the bottom line is climate is only one of the things driving this, and that's one of the reasons that it's so difficult to sort out what the role of fire and climate is that there are all these other factors driving this. One of the things that has occurred to us is it could just be that some of the patterns we see are not related to climate as much as they are just changes in management practices. And this is suggested in this figure I showed earlier, where on Forest Service lands we see a decline in area burn in the first half of the century, the 20th century, and then an increase ever since. And there's been a lot of fire scientists who have been saying, well, this is a reflection of global warming here, causing higher temperatures, bigger fires, because you see this pattern in a lot of parts in the West in forests. But on our CAL FIRE landscapes, we see it decline and then it never goes back up. It could be that this is not related at all to climate. Could this be due to changes in fire management? And the one change that's most significant is how fires have been fought over the last 100 years. In the 1930s, state and federal agencies developed what they called the 10 a.m. policy. The 10 a.m. policy meant that if you have a fire in your jurisdiction, you need to throw all resources at that fire to get it out as soon as you can, and hopefully by 10 a.m. the next day. And that policy was in effect for about 35 years on Forest Service lands until about the 1960s. In the 1960s, people realized that, hey, fire is a natural part of these forests. It's always been there, and we're actually causing more damage by putting the fires out because fuels are accumulating. So we should let fires burn more, and so they threw out the 10 a.m. policy, and they replaced it with something called the contain and constrain policy, which meant when you get a fire in your forest, you should try and contain it within a watershed, but you shouldn't necessarily try and get it out by 10 a.m. the next day. And as a result, fires potentially have gotten larger over the last 50 years. So this could be a reflection of nothing more than a change in policy. And you don't see this increase on CAL FIRE lands because CAL FIRE lands, they still have a 10 a.m. policy. In the lower elevation, when a fire starts, they throw everything at it to get it out as soon as possible, not just because chaparral fires are more dangerous, but because people live on those lower elevation landscapes. And we see the difference when you compare fires that start in the forest versus lower elevations. When I spent most of my career in Southern California, and there, when you got a fire going, you needed to throw everything at it as fast as possible because within just 3 or 4 hours, it could burn 10 or 20,000 acres. And so the 10 a.m. policy is really important on these landscapes. In the forested systems, they don't do that at all. In fact, this was brought home to me when I first moved to Sequoia National Park. And in July, they had a storm come through the park. And I had an email, and it said there were 13 fires that were started in the park. So we should meet tomorrow to discuss what to do about them. It's a very different policy when you're in the forested landscapes than in the lower elevation landscapes. So we have to keep in mind that it's one of the difficulties in trying to parse out the role of climate on fire activity is there's just all these other things that are get in the way. Now, just to summarize, I like to think of this poem, and this is from a website called The Poetry of Donald Rumsfeld. And what this website attempted to do is went back and looked at Donald Rumsfeld's speeches and realized that some of his speeches were very poetic. And so they created this website. And this particular speech of his actually describes where we're at in terms of fire-climate relationships. This was a speech he gave with respect to the Iraq War. And he made these famous quotes or statements about, as we know, there are no knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. And that's probably as good an illustration of where we're at in terms of understanding fire climate. And I tend to think this speech is best read in a cadence reflective of Dr. Seuss. It fits it very, very well. So I'll end it there and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, John. So we do have time for questions, but I'm going to ask that you either stand up and go to one of the microphones, or you wait for me to give you this microphone.
And one thing I might mention, in case you have to leave, is there's a flyer back there, and it talks about some of the fire research that we've been doing in the southern half of the state, which is related to wildland-urban interface issues. In other words, dealing with fires that burn across the wildland into the urban environment. We've been doing a lot of research, and USGS has put out a film. This is a 22-minute film that describes that research. If you're interested, I have maybe a dozen of the CDs here, or there's a flyer back there that has the website where you can download an 11-minute version. So if you're not a glutton for punishment, you might want to just download the 11-minute version. I highly recommend it for no other reason than the first couple minutes of the film shows Richard Nixon on his house in Bel Air during the 1960 Bel Air fire with a hose trying to keep the fire from burning down his house. It's classic footage, which my understanding is USGS paid a pretty penny to be able to use that footage. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address anything.
A few years back, I attended a lecture here that described how invasive plants are maybe the fastest growing after a fire in California, perhaps Southern California. Do you have any comment on how susceptible those invasive plants, I think they would mostly be chaparral type plants, might have on,
Well, it's very likely I was the one that gave that talk, because I did give a talk on fire and invasive plants one. It's a huge issue in the lower elevations, particularly in shrublands. And one of the reasons is I talk about chaparral and describe this as a fire-adapted ecosystem, but it's actually a misnomer. It's not fire-adapted. It's adapted to a very particular fire regime. And if you start increasing the fires too frequently, the shrublands can't recover. They don't have enough time to produce seeds. The lignotubers or burls don't have enough time to store carbohydrates. And so you end up losing the chaparral if you burn too frequently. And nature abhors a vacuum, and so when you burn too frequently, get rid of the chaparral, what you get is herbaceous things coming in. And the most invasive species we have are non-native species that come from the Mediterranean. And so, and in fact, many of the grasslands in the state are not natural grasslands. They were at one time shrublands, and we burn them very frequently. Now, when you look at these golden hills around here, mostly what you're seeing are non-native invasive species, not native species. And you can get a good view of how this has happened in the past if you drive down the coast ranges along the coast along Highway 101. You'll see all sorts of interesting mosaics where you'll have grasslands on one slope, and then you'll have a patch of shrubland on another, and that almost certainly is a result of disturbance from too frequent fire. That landscape was probably all shrubland at one time, and it's just been converted into these invasive grasslands.
How much is this likely to generalize outside of California? Will we see a very different pattern if we were looking at Pacific Northwest or the Rockies? And what I'm thinking of here is Colorado's problem with pine beetle kill, where sustained warm winter temperatures seem to be setting the stage for some mega fires.
Well, I think that the important lesson from what I have to say is we probably should try and avoid generalizations entirely, because the characteristics that drive fires differ, like we can see in the Sierra Nevada, depending on whether you're up in the mountains or down in the foothills. And so just going across that gradient, you see differences. When you look at, there's been a fair number of fire climate studies throughout the West, and the bottom line is what you see is just about every region is driven by a different climatic parameter, or at least the association is different in different regions. So the one thing that I think that we know at the present time is we probably should avoid generalizations, and every landscape is potentially driven by a different set of factors. And so that's why when you see these headlines in newspapers that the American West is burning up due to global warming, that's just a vast overgeneralization. And at the present time, I don't think we can say that. And so and in fact, it's illustrated in a study that we just had accepted this last week, where we compared fire climate models to explain past fire activity in the western U.S., largely California and Oregon. And we compared that with the Mediterranean basin. And what we found is we could get really good models that would explain fire all across the Mediterranean basin, but we couldn't get it in the U.S., in the Pacific Northwest, or well, in the Pacific region And I think the primary reason is because in the Mediterranean basin, it's distributed along roughly the same latitude. And so the climates are roughly similar across the Mediterranean basin. But in California and Oregon, it's distributed latitudinally. Excuse me. And as a result, the climates are very different from the north to the south, very different in the Rocky Mountains than they are in the Sierra Nevada. And as a consequence, we couldn't come up with a good model that explained fire activity for the western region. So the answer is no, I don't think we can generalize it.
Are you hopeful in the long term that the change in policy to reintroduce fire by the Forest Service will be a good thing over time?
I think that it has to be recognized that different landscapes have been differentially affected by fires. So just the blanket reintroduction of fire is absolutely the wrong thing to do. As that one figure showed of the state where the Southern California was yellow and the Sierras in Northern California are blue, that basically says Southern California has had too much fire. We don't need to introduce fire there. The other part of the state has had too little fire, and we do need to introduce fire there. So, for example, I live in Sequoia National Park, and they do prescription burning every year, and it's really essential because they have had 125 years of fire suppression, and the fuel loads have gone up at least an order of magnitude. So they have a really dangerous situation. They need to introduce fire to those systems. The problem is, and this is really a problem if you work for the government, is people like simple answers. They like one answer that explains everything. And the media will respond the same way. They like one story about fire. So they're constantly taking this problem of a need to reintroduce fire into forests and want to apply it everywhere. And it doesn't need to be applied everywhere. Southern part of the state, we have way too much fire. So we don't need to reintroduce fire. We need to actually work on keeping fire out of the system rather than putting it back in. So bottom line is, once again, there's not just a simple model that explains everything. That depends on where you're at, what the fire regime is like, and what the history of fire has been.
Any comments about the cost effectiveness of these various attempts to try to mitigate or reduce fire risk, such as reintroduction of or prescribed fire in, say, the Sequoia National Park or Yosemite or other places where probably studies have been done? Where we have used fire, it's been fairly successful, like in Sequoia National Park. It's probably been very important in terms of protecting the giant sequoias, because most of the prescribed burning in Sequoia is done in giant sequoia forests. And they've had many of those forests where they've done 2 or 3 prescribed burns over the last 30 years. And they've done a very good job keeping the fuels down, protecting the giant sequoias. The problem is that those parks represent something like Sequoia and Kings Canyon, 800,000 acres. And they want to restore fire back to its original frequency of maybe every 20 years. So to do that, every 20 years to burn 800,000 acres, how many acres do you have to burn a year? You have to burn a heck of a lot more than what they burn. They burn right now about 5,000 acres, which is almost an order of magnitude too low. And it's not a simple matter of just increasing the amount of area you burn, because they are constrained by air quality issues. So if they want to do a prescribed burn, the air quality district, the San Joaquin Valley, will tell them if they can or cannot, and if the air quality is not good, they will tell them that they can't burn. Even if there's a wildfire and they want to let it burn to restore conditions in these forests, San Joaquin Air Quality District will force them to put those fires out if the air quality is bad. And it's really something that's hard to rectify because I understand why you need to burn in those forests. I live in Three Rivers, though, and I understand why the Air Quality District doesn't want them to burn. It is really horrible in the summer when they're doing prescribed burns and they get down canyon winds that bring that smoke into the community. It's really very obnoxious. So here is someone like myself who understands why they do it, and I despise it at certain times of the year. So I can only imagine what many of the other citizens think. As a result, we may not ever be able to restore those forests to their historical condition using fire. We might have to do mechanical treatments, and that creates a whole other set of problems because in national parks, we can't do that. It's against the legislation that was put into effect when the parks were created. Now, forests can do it. The National Forest Service can do it. The parks can't do that. And so it's a real dilemma. I mean, the bottom line is we don't know what the solution is. We know we're not there by a long shot. Now, in terms of some parts of the state, like Southern California, mostly we don't need to do prescription burning, but it's not done anymore at all, except rarely, largely because it's just too dangerous. And there's too many expensive homes. And so what they do on those landscapes when they want to modify fuels is they do what they call mastication. They bring these big machines in and they just chop the heck out of everything. And they think that helps. But there's a lot of resistance against it in the southern part of the state.
You showed a graph where the frequency was very high in the 20s and then starting to decline. In the 20s was also the time, according to documentaries, when a large number of people, the automobile, the cars, people started coming into cars into the forest, and then the ensuing roads and stuff like that. It is possible that could be a contributing factor. It would give you a quantum.
Well, if it's gratifying at all, I wrote a paper once and made that very same comment, that I thought increased fire activity in the 20s was potentially affected by the increase in roads and in cars. For example, between 1915 and 1925, there was an order of magnitude increase in cars in the state. And so the forests were seeing people for the first time. And the other thing that was going on is many of the people who were in the state at the time were from the east, and they did not understand fire in this part of the world. And so they were very careless with the way they treated fire. So in the 20s, a lot of that increased activity could be due to people. But it also needs to be recognized that we were in a severe drought in the 20s. So that also affects it. It's just an illustration that these things are really hard to tease out one particular factor. And that's why when you're trying to understand this, you really need to put all of these together in more complex models to try and tease out how much is due to each of these factors.
Thank you.
I might mention, when we're done with the questions, if you're interested at all, that 11-minute video that I mentioned, we actually have it on here. I could put it on if you want to stay after the question and answer for 11 minutes and watch it. So when we're done with the question, I'll let Diane tell me when I'm done, and then I'll just start it right up and you can take a look.
This question does not have to do with the climate. It has to do with the fires that we had last summer. I understood from the media that they were different because they were hotter and more destructive. Could you comment on the potential regeneration of those forests that were burned in those devastating fires that were hotter and more destructive? I understand that they went up, like I said, they were hotter, they were more destructive, they went up into the crowns, they were hotter for the ground. That's my question.
Yeah, and I assume you're talking about the big fire event like in the Sequoias, the one called the Rough Fire.
The Rough Fire I thought was really bad.
Yeah. And it was. It burned a lot of forests. And if you talk to anybody in the Forest Service about this, they will tell you that this is a result of fire suppression. We've been putting fires out. It's caused fuels to accumulate. I tend to disagree with that as the primary explanation, because one of the things that's not recognized about these forests is these forests have been cut over and over again in the last 100 years. Silviculture and timber harvesting has been a major function of the national forest in California. So the area burned by the rough fire, and the same is true with the rim fire in 2013. Most of the area that burned was in forest, and most of it burned in really high-intensity fires, and most of it was dominated by relatively young, dense plantations of trees that had been planted after the 1987 Stanislaus fire. And as a result, they had really bad fuels in those forests, but it wasn't due to fire suppression. It was due to silviculture, timber harvesting, and they had really dense fuels. But I'll tell you, you can't get anybody to recognize that. I know I was on NPR after the rim fire, and the deputy for USDA was on there, and they asked him, well, what caused the rim fire? He says, fire suppression. We've been putting fires out for 100 years, and it caused all the fuels to accumulate. And then I raised the issue, well, what about silviculture? We've been doing timber harvesting, and I've been in that Stanislaus forest, and it's very dense thickets of young plantations with our really dense fuels. And he wouldn't touch that topic at all.
So after these devastating fires that were so intense, what is the potential for regeneration now?
Well, it's going to be very high, because the Forest Service basically goes in and plants. They've given up on nature. Oh. So the Forest Service goes in and they create plantations. And so they will grow up trees. They don't even necessarily have to be the same species that was there. They will get whatever they can get from their nurseries, and they will plant forests. And sometimes they'll change the composition to produce better timber species on those lands.
So it's not a mix of trees, it's just a tree
farm?
Well,
it varies a lot from one forest to another, whatever they're doing. But the bottom line is these areas are devastated, and it would take probably a century or 2 centuries to regenerate on their own. But the Forest Service will go in and replant those areas with plantations, and so they will get replanted. But the fuels, for the next 50 years are going to be pretty dangerous, because the only way that you can maintain plantations when you're doing timber harvesting and replanting is you have to thin those forests out to keep the fuel loads down. It's too expensive to do that. And as a result, they plant these up and they get these really dense fuels. And so when a fire comes and burns it, it's not fire suppression. It's basically plantations that they've grown up. Because they had to suppress fires in those plantations, because the plantations would have gone up in a crown fire if you had allowed a fire in there. So the problem with these big fires you're talking about is largely on the forest lands, I think largely a function of past timber harvesting practices. But when you get into the national parks, it's a whole different story. In fact, you can see that with the rim fire and the rough fire. As soon as those fires hit the national parks, the fires died down and just burned as low-intensity fires in the understory, and that's because the parks for the last 40 years have been doing prescribed burns. And they have kept the fuels down, and they haven't done timber harvesting, so they don't have thickets of young trees to burn. So you can see very clearly from those 2 fire events how the management practices have had big impacts on the fires.
Thank you.
Sure.
So we have time for, did we still have one comment? Okay, and we have time for maybe one question after that, and then we're going to have to say goodnight.
I'm retired Forest Service, and one of my last jobs was I was a regional program manager for reforestation in California. And your comment about the Forest Service is going to go in and plant everything, I think that's 20 to 30 years behind the times, because right now, if I had a budget to do that, if I were still working for the Forest Service. I would have to have roughly, I'm guessing now, something on the order of 50 times the amount of money that I had 30 years ago. And the amount of money that I had 30 years ago is incredibly small relative to what would be necessary to do what you say is going to be done.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
It isn't going to happen.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
Mostly what the Forest Service is doing right now is saying, yes, we know we ought to reforest. Yes, we know that's what the law says, but we don't have the budget.
Yeah.
And right now,
no, I think you're right.
We aren't going to do it.
I was describing what the Forest Service would plan on doing. And what they plan on doing is not necessarily what they can do based on money. And a lot of it has to do with these issues I raised early on about fire suppression budgets. All that money going into fire suppression, it takes away from doing all these other projects. And you're right, the agencies haven't solved the problem. And I had somebody from the Region 5 Forest Service office tell me one time when I was telling them that we didn't need to do any prescribed burning in chaparral landscapes. We already had plenty of fire. And other people were arguing, no, we need to treat them just like forests. And this guy said, you know, money is going to solve this question. He said, we don't have money to do all the burning that people want to do, so we're going to do it where we know it has some effect in the forest, and we're probably not going to do it in chaparral. And so in that sense, you know, I win because there isn't enough money to do what I say they shouldn't be doing. But you're right, money changes everything. Okay, why don't I turn on this movie?
Well, okay, I just want to go ahead and thank you all for showing up tonight, and I want to thank John, and I would like us to all give him another big round of applause. Great, for a wonderful talk.